Have you ever wondered how many stories from the past were never written down, just swallowed whole by the sea? The morning was gray, windless, and heavy with salt. At the edge of the rocky shore, the tide retreated like a secret, leaving behind slick stones and broken shells. A boy's boot sat wedged between two rocks, waterlogged and abandoned. It belonged to Elias Carter, age 9. He had been at the Thornhill Orphan House for barely 4 months, and now he was gone. The staff told the town sheriff he'd run off. A troubled boy, always wandering, Miss Nettie, the headmistress, said with a dismissive tone. Wouldn't surprise me if he caught a ship or stowed away with the fishermen. You know these children. They come with nothing and crave adventure. Sheriff Tilson jotted a few notes, mostly out of courtesy. He was not a man who liked trouble, and Thornhill had always kept to itself. But still, he found it strange the boy's room still had his belongings folded neatly under the bed, including a worn leather satchel that bore his name in careful stitching. Elias had nowhere to go, no family to return to, and no means of surviving a winter alone. But the investigation ended as quickly as it started. There was no body, no witness, no crime, just another lost orphan, forgotten as easily as he had arrived. 2 days earlier, Thornhill ran as it always had. Routine was treated as scripture. Wake before dawn, morning hymns, cold porridge, chores, scripture reading, silence, lights out at dusk. The building itself was a crumbling monument to charity, a 3-story stone structure on the cliff's edge, built back in 1837 with generous donations from the East Shore Baptist Society. Its large windows were permanently fogged by salt and mildew. The sea could be heard in every room, a slow, constant breathing, like something alive beneath the floorboards. Elias had never liked the sea, not the way it moved, or the sound it made at night. He'd been overheard saying that once to another boy, in whispers. Sometimes I think it's talking to them, the ones in charge. I think they hear it. He'd made few friends, but there was one, a stuttering, soft-eyed boy named Jonah, younger by 2 years. They often swept the chapel steps together, or polished the brass altar fixtures under the watchful eyes of Miss Nettie or Mr. Horrocks, the silent groundskeeper who rarely spoke but always seemed to be listening. 2 nights before Elias disappeared, he'd left his bed during a storm. Jonah saw him through the rain-streaked window. He was barefoot, in only a nightshirt, walking slowly toward the cliff path where the railing had long since rotted away. No one else saw, Jonah told Miss Nettie in the morning, but she silenced him with a firm grip to the wrist and a whispered warning. You didn't see anything, and if you say otherwise, you'll be next. A century and a half later, the Thornhill building is gone, collapsed in 1912 during a coastal landslide. The official record blames erosion and structural neglect, but some locals, especially those old enough to remember their grandparents' stories, speak differently. A faded photograph remains in the archives. 11 children in gray uniforms stand in a row outside the orphanage chapel. Miss Nettie towers behind them, thin-lipped and unsmiling. One boy, however, appears to be moving, a blur in the lower corner, almost as if he was turning away at the last second. The name scribbled on the back, Elias Carter, 1861, and under it, someone later added in pencil, the first one. The letter was unsigned, folded into a brittle envelope, and buried between pages of a church maintenance ledger from 1861. It wasn't discovered until 1994, when a local librarian began cataloging the contents of the East Shore Baptist Society's archive, mostly ignored for decades. Thick with mold and the smell of paper decay. The ink was faded, the handwriting spidery, as though the author's hand had trembled. They had written it like a confession. If you are reading this, you are already closer than anyone has come. The sea does not take what it is not given. And Thornhill, ... we gave no name, no return address, no date, though the envelope was wedged beside a ledger entry from November 19th, the day after Elias vanished. The librarian, Carol Stratton, made a copy and sent it to the local historical society. It was filed away with the rest of the Thornhill remnants. No further investigation was made. No one ever asked who had written it, or what, exactly, they meant by given. But the ledger itself offered clues. Several pages were torn out. On the remaining ones, expenditures were itemized. Food deliveries, soap, lamp oil, firewood. Then, abruptly, beginning in October 1861, a new monthly entry, salt offering, midnight tied to 3-count. 3-count. October, November, December. No explanation. No standard accounting term matched that phrase. Carol had asked a retired theology professor about the term salt offering. He explained it was biblical and ancient sacrifice used to purify and bind covenants. But in modern Christian doctrine, it had no literal application. Unless, he had added cautiously, you're dealing with a cult, not a church. Back in 1861, the town of Dovetail Bay had been small, fiercely religious, and largely isolated. The people there believed deeply in order, humility, and the sanctity of obedience. The East Shore Baptist Society had run 3 schools and 1 orphanage, the latter considered an act of moral duty, a place where souls without guidance would be shaped under Scripture. And it was run by Annette Blimus, Nettie. Locals from the era described her as a woman of unusual discipline, with no known family, and a coldness even the other staff found difficult to work with. Yet she remained in charge for 15 years, appointed by the society and protected by its board. Jonah had remembered her voice vividly for the rest of his life. In 1913, just after the Thornhill collapse, a dying Jonah, then 62 years old, dictated a brief testimony to his niece. He said the night Elias vanished, he had heard not one set of footsteps, but many, adult voices, and chanting not in Latin, not in English. Something else. He said he stayed under his covers, too afraid to breathe. The next day, Elias was gone. No search was organized. No panic, just a silent breakfast, and one less bowl on the table. Miss Nettie passed Jonah in the hallway that morning. She did not stop or speak, but she placed one gloved hand on his head and smiled when his niece asked him what he thought really happened. Jonah had shaken his head. They called it an orphanage, but it wasn't meant to raise children. It was meant to empty them. She never understood what he meant. The historical record of Thornhill stops after 1872. After that, the society ceased funding it. In 1873, 2 staff members were found drowned at the base of the cliff, ruled accidental. Miss Nettie vanished from the public record shortly after. One last thing, in the coastal registry, there's a note from a sailor, dated the same year Elias vanished. He had been hired to take crate-sealed ones from the Thornhill groundskeeper to a point 2 miles offshore. When asked what was in the crates, the sailor had simply said, didn't weigh like food, or books felt like people. The record books from Thornhill were meticulous, but only up to a point. From 1851 to 1860, the orphanage kept clear logs of every child admitted, every death from illness, every departure to an adoptive home. Names, dates, even the local families who came to collect a child were written in precise ink. But in 1861, the ink began to thin. Pages grew shorter, fewer details, and then, by 1862, they were reduced to numbers, simple, impersonal tally marks beside initials. No last names, no destinations, just lists. By 1865, the names vanished altogether, and the number of children recorded as placed in homes vastly exceeded the number of families known to have visited. Carol Stratton hadn't been looking for any of this when she began her volunteer work at the Dovetail Historical Society. She was an archivist by training, a grandmother by heart, and someone who had grown up hearing rumors about Thornhill but never believed them. Now, seated at a long wooden table in the archive basement. She flipped through a sun-bleached register that smelled like sea salt and mold. She paused when she reached an entry for a girl labeled only as E.M. The column beside it read, "Placed March 6, 1862 notes, taken after tide." Carol underlined that phrase and sat back in her chair. Taken after tide, not adopted, not relocated. Taken, she had already reviewed 4 other children from the same period each, labeled with some variation of this phrase. Tide night, high tide, after the wave. She closed the book and stared out the window, where the modern coastline of Dovetail glimmered peacefully beneath the late morning sun. Sailboats moved like white teeth across the horizon. Children played along the sandbar, and yet here, in the basement, were quiet screams written in ink. That night, Carol called her colleague Martin Delaney, a retired professor of religious history from Boston College. She had worked with him before, mostly on obscure Puritan documents and old town sermons. She read the entries to him over the phone. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Did the Thornhill Orphanage ever have a chapel?" "Yes," Carol said. "It was at the center of the building. Small, domed, brick interior." "Was it built with a font?" he asked. She paused. "A font, stone basin, usually baptism, but in some fringe sects, fonts were used for offering symbolic washings of sin or surrender." "You said there was mention of a salt offering." Carol nodded, realizing he couldn't see her. "Yes, ledger entries in the same year. Repeated monthly. Martin sighed. "There's precedent. Not common, but there are fringe sects that believed the sea was a vessel for sacrifice. Water was seen not just as cleanser, but as conveyor. They believed certain tides could carry offerings to divine forces." "You're saying they sacrificed the children?" "I'm saying," he answered slowly, "that they might have believed it wasn't murder, that it was devotion." In the winter of 1862, Thornhill was at half capacity. Letters from visiting missionaries described the children as quiet, obedient, and cleansed of wildness. One visitor remarked on how they never cried, even the younger ones. Another noted how unusually pale they were. One letter, dated January 11, 1862, and addressed to the East Shore Baptist Society's board, praised the transformation of the orphans from undisciplined castaways to silent saints. The letter ended with, "We do not fear the sea, we trust it, and in return, it will deliver us." There was no signature. Jonah, still only 7 at the time, remembered little of that winter, but in the few pages of his final dictated statement scribbled shakily in 1913, he recounted a memory of children being taken from their beds at night by candlelight. Always the same pattern, the older ones first, 3 at a time. He said the morning after, the beds would be stripped clean, their clothes gone, and the staff would speak to no one about them. When he asked where they had gone, Miss Nettie would reply, "Home, where the water meets the sky." At the age of 10, Jonah stopped asking by the end of that year. He was the oldest child left in the coastal police record. A ship manifest dated April 1863 listed Thornhill as a stopover point for the delivery of sea salt and cured fish. The record included 5 sealed crates loaded by a man identified as H.R., likely Horrocks the mute groundskeeper. The sailor who transported them later described the crates as too light for goods, too long for tools. He said nothing more and refused further work from the orphanage. When authorities tried to verify the contents years later, the Thornhill building had already begun to collapse from coastal erosion. The basement had caved in. Records were destroyed. The land was eventually fenced off. And then came the landslide of 1912. Jonah died in the spring of 1913. Shortly after recounting his memories to his niece, at his bedside, she said, he kept repeating a single phrase, over and over, "The sea doesn't forget." Back in the present, Carol stared at a cracked window of the archive building. Rain had begun to fall. The tide would be rising soon. She opened a fresh notebook and wrote the names she could gather: Elias, Jonah, E.M., and the unnamed initials from the ledgers. She had 13 partial identities, possibly more, and each of them, at some point between 1861 and 1865, had vanished, not relocated, not adopted. Vanished. The road to the old Thornhill site was barely marked. A rusted gate hung crooked at the entrance of a narrow dirt path, flanked by thorn-covered hedges and the remnants of a stone wall. The wooden sign that once bore the orphanage's name had long since rotted away. Only 2 letters remained, carved faintly into the stone near the entrance: T and H, worn smooth by wind and sea spray. Carol parked her car 100 yards down and approached on foot. The sky was overcast, and a briny chill hung in the air. The closer she got to the cliff's edge, the more silent the world became. Even the birds had stopped. She stood now at the very edge of what once had been the Thornhill courtyard. Time had buried most of the foundation under dirt and grass. A few broken bricks jutted from the earth like ribs. A jagged stone, cross-toppled and half-buried, marked what had likely been the orphanage chapel. Carol crouched and placed her hand on it. The stone was cold, damp. She walked a few paces west, toward where the kitchen wing was once drawn on the old floor plans. She had studied them for days before coming here. Most of the Thornhill structure was simple and utilitarian, but the chapel had a sub-level unusual for buildings of that period. A partial cellar, sealed from the rest of the orphanage. No stairs connecting it to the upper floors, just a narrow hatch marked font storage. No one knew if it still existed. Carol moved cautiously, prodding the overgrown grass with her boot heel. She reached the southern side of the ruins, where the cliff began to slant downward into jagged rock. A seagull called distantly. Then her foot struck something hollow. She dropped to her knees and cleared the grass. Beneath it was a rectangular panel, yarn or steel, deeply rusted and covered with soil. She scraped gently with a trowel until the outline of a handle emerged, fused shut with age. She paused, breath fogging in the cold air. This was it, the hatch. Carol stood and looked out over the sea for a moment. The tide was still low. She had a couple of hours. She retrieved a crowbar from her backpack, wedged it beneath the handle, and began to pry. The metal screamed in protest, but gave way. The hatch lifted just an inch at first, then 2. A gust of damp air rose from the opening, sour and cold. It smelled of mildew and salt, but beneath that something else, something faintly metallic. She pulled the hatch open fully and peered down a ladder, rusted and rotted, descended into darkness. No light reached the bottom. She clipped a flashlight to her coat and started down slowly, one step at a time. The wood creaked but held. Water dripped somewhere below. The cellar wasn't large, maybe 12 feet across, circular. The walls were lined with stone, slick with moss. At the center stood a wide, waist-high basin carved from a single piece of dark marble. The font. It was chipped at the rim and filled with standing water, black with age. Around the base were faint etchings. Not Latin, not English. Symbols. Spirals and triangles interwoven in ways Carol didn't recognize. She moved the flashlight slowly around the room. On the far wall hung 6 wooden pegs. From each hung what remained of linen garments, rotted, faded, children's sizes. She turned to leave. That's when she saw the box, tucked in the shadows behind the font. A wooden chest, small and square, half-eaten by rot. The hinges had crumbled away. The lid lifted easily, but inside were scrolls of parchment trapped in oilskin. Carol carefully opened one. It was a record, a ledger, but not in the same handwriting as the others. These were personal, detailed, each child listed by first name, date of arrival, and condition, and beside each, a mark drawn in red ink. Some had a cross, others a circle. The last scroll was different. It was a list of hymns, but not hymns from any known book. These were handwritten, stanzas lyrical, repetitive, with phrases like, "Salt to the sea, 3 by 3, the tide shall rise, and take what's free." Carol stood in silence, reading each line with growing discomfort. These were not songs of mourning, they were invocations. She returned the scrolls to the chest, closed the lid, and took a single parchment with Hertha, one with the children's names, as she climbed back out of the hatch. The wind had changed, colder, faster. The tide was coming, and by the time she reached her car, Carol's hands were shaking. She had proof now, not just theory, not just rumor, proof that Thornhill kept a hidden chamber, proof that they had recorded something someone secretly, and proof that they had sung to the sea that night. She scanned the parchment at home and began cross-referencing it with Dovetail's old census records. She found one match, a child named Ruth Ch. 8, admitted in August 1862. No adoption record, no burial. The census listed her as deceased, but no date, no cause. Only a brief note, vanished during storm tide. No remains recovered. Carol leaned back, her chest tight. The sea didn't forget, but people did. Carol sat in the glow of her desk lamp well past midnight, eyes scanning old census files with the slow determination of someone who knew she was chasing something real, something buried. The parchment she'd found in the Thornhill cellar, now digitally scanned and stored, contained 47 names. All children, all marked with a symbol. Only 5 names had accompanying crosses. The rest had circles. She didn't yet know what either meant, but she was beginning to suspect the circles signified something permanent, something final. She highlighted each name in her notebook. Then, beside them, one by one, she added columns: date of admission, status in town census, any traceable adoption records. Most had none, but then she paused. One name, Lyle Merrick, age 12, admitted in April 1861, circle next to his name, but, unlike the others, Lyle's surname was uncommon. A search through Dovetail's regional ancestry files brought up a lead Merrick Henry, born 1914, listed as grandson of L. Merrick, D., unknown. Henry's last known residence was just outside Lowell, Massachusetts. It was a long shot, but the thread was real. 3 days later, Carol pulled into a narrow gravel driveway, flanked by wild hedges and a crooked mailbox. The house was modest white paint peeling, a porch swing hanging motionless. She walked to the front door and knocked. An old man opened it. Wispy white hair, sharp eyes, and a cautious posture. "Mr. Merrick." He looked her over. "Depends who's asking." "I'm not selling anything," she said with a soft smile. "I'm a historical researcher. I think your grandfather may have been connected to the Thornhill Orphanage." His expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered. A pause. Then, "Come in, but don't talk loud. I've got enough ghosts in this place already." Henry Merrick's living room smelled of dust, old newspapers, and wood polish. A wall of books towered behind a rocking chair, beside which stood a table cluttered with medication bottles, magnifying glasses, and a cracked photograph frame. Carol glanced at the picture. It was sepia-toned, 2 children, unsmiling, standing in front of a large brick building. Thornhill. Henry saw her looking. "That's my grandfather, and his sister. They weren't supposed to survive Thornhill, but they did." Carol's heart skipped. "So Lyle did make it out." Henry nodded, barely. "He never talked about it, but he wrote things down. Not for the family, he was scared of what we'd think, but I found them after he passed. Letters, notes, pieces of things that don't make sense, unless you know what you're looking for." Carol leaned forward. "May I see them?" He gave her a long look, then stood and shuffled down a short hallway. When he returned, he carried a shoebox, siloed, brittle, and tied shut with twine. He set it in her lap. "Take it. I don't want it in this house anymore." That night, Carol read every scrap of paper under a desk lamp. her hands trembling more with each page. Lyle's writing was broken and messy, written over years, childish at first, then desperate, almost unhinged. But the messages were consistent. They told us the sea was holy, that we were offerings, that if we obeyed, we would never be cold or hungry again. 3 children every new moon. Always 3. They said the sea demanded balance. I hid in the grain cellar during the last hymn. I heard them praying, singing like it was beautiful. It wasn't. It was hollow. When I came back, the beds were empty again. They didn't notice I was still there. I think they wanted it that way. Most chilling was a short, final entry, scrawled in shaking hand. I still hear the water when I close my eyes. Still see them walking barefoot toward the cliff. Not screaming, just walking. Carol sat in silence for nearly an hour after reading. The last page, he had escaped. But not really. The trauma had followed him into adulthood, stitched into his mind like salt into skin. Lyle hadn't run away from Thornhill. He had survived it by vanishing, blending back and pretending to be gone. And when the staff finally stopped looking, he walked out on his own. He never told anyone what he saw, until now. The next morning, Carol revisited the digital scans of the scrolls from the Thornhill cellar. She found Lyle's name again, this time listed with a note beside it. Withheld deferred cycle, unsuitable for tide. Deferred. They had skipped him. Why? She combed through the scroll again and noticed a second note beside another child. Eva Merrick, removed illness. His sister. A theory formed perhaps. The staff believed their offering needed to be whole, or perhaps the children were chosen in trios for a reason. If one was sick or weak, they skipped the group entirely. She opened a second scroll, the hymn scroll, and studied the last verses. Salt for the sky, blood for the sea, 3 for the waves, none shall flee. 3, always 3, and when they couldn't complete the trio, they waited. Carol began assembling a list, all recorded instances of deferred cycles. There were only 2. Lyle was one. The other was a girl marked SJ with a note. Escaped dormitory, still unclean. Carol flipped back to the parchment of names. S.J. She hadn't thought much of it before, but now, she reopened her archive folder and found an old visitor report from 1864. Signed by a woman named Sarah Jennings, a mission worker who had toured Thornhill and later declined to return. Her final comment had seemed odd at the time. I heard the waves speaking that night, not aloud, but I heard them, and I could not sleep. S.J. Sarah Jennings hadn't been staff. She had been a child, a survivor. The interview with Abigail Finch haunted Charles. Her voice, measured, cold, precise, wasn't the voice of a lunatic. It was the voice of someone who had seen things others had buried. He reviewed her handwritten testimonies by candlelight that night. Over and over, her words formed the same phrase. The sea keeps its secrets. We only feed it. By the next morning, Charles knew he couldn't delay. The truth wouldn't come from dusty ledgers or vague rumors. It was buried somewhere deep physically, perhaps literally. And so, with thick boots, a lantern, and his journal, he returned to the edge of Harrow's Bay. He didn't head toward the front of the orphanage this time. Instead, he followed the rocky coastline behind the building, tracing the cliffside path Abigail had once described, a footpath long, eroded by time and tide. His coat caught on thorned vines, and the wind sliced through his sleeves, but he pressed forward. After nearly an hour of scrambling along slick rocks and navigating natural crevices, he found it, a narrow opening in the rock face, half concealed behind twisted bramble and stone. At first glance, it resembled nothing more than a natural cave, but Charles had seen enough mining tunnels to recognize when a space had been carved by human hands. He ducked inside, lifting the lantern. The air was damp and metallic. The tunnel dipped downward steeply, carved crudely into the rock, walls slick with lichen. Old wooden support beams, some splintered, others collapsed, lined the ceiling, and deep within, A cold whisper seemed to echo with every step. He moved slowly, careful not to trip on uneven stone. Rough scratches were etched into the wall, initials, hash marks, and one's a small, childlike drawing of a stick figure with arms outstretched toward the sea. Then he saw it, a rusted metal door half off its hinges, sunken into the rock. Beyond, it was a chamber far larger than he'd expected, and the smell wrought, mold, salt, time, inside. The chamber were 5 narrow stone slabs arranged in a row, each spaced like altars, shackles old and iron hung from chains above them. The floor bore stains that had long since dried, and in one corner, a heap of decayed cloth, children's clothing, nightgowns, socks too, small to fit any adult. His breath caught. This was no storm shelter or sea cave. It was a ritual space. He stumbled back, nearly tripping on a protruding root, and then caught his footing as his lantern passed over a wall, etched in markings named. Dozens of them, some faded, others legible. Jonas, Mina, L. Carter, George, are beneath each, a datesome, a decade apart. Others, just days. The oldest inscription read, "Let the sea keep them, 1794. And below that, the line repeated by Abigail, "We only feed it." That night, Charles wrote until his hands ached. If this were published in the Gazette, he'd be declared mad. But he knew what he'd seen. These were no accidents, no drownings. They were sacrifices, ritualistic killings of children offered to the sea, and it had been happening since before the orphanage was even built. But why? He needed more than physical evidence. He needed records, testimonies, a motive, proof. So he returned to the town archives. This time he requested access to the pre-orphanage land ownership records. There it was, in faded ink, sealed in wax, 1803. Transfer of land at Harrow's Bay to the of Massachusetts. Previous owner, Reverend Elisha Thorne. He knew that name. Thorne was a fire and brimstone preacher, known for his isolationist sect, the Purified Brethren, a group that splintered from mainstream Protestantism in the late 1700s. Records said they'd vanished after a series of disciplinary investigations by the church council. Rumors claimed they believed the sea was divine. Punishment and endless hunger that required obedience. Sacrifice. It wasn't until later that Charles connected the dots in a separate binder, filed under deaths 1800 to 1820. He found a line item, November 12, 1801. 5 children drowned at Harrow's Bay, cause accident during baptismal ceremony. The same date was etched on the chamber wall. Not an accident, a pattern, and then something else, a transcript of a court statement from the Reverend himself. The sea must be fed, or we shall be taken instead. It is not cruelty, it is exchange. Now, Charles had begun to understand. The orphanage was no act of charity. It was a continuation, a way to provide the sea with its offerings without scrutiny. Abandoned children, forgotten children, children no one would search for. His hands trembled as he reviewed the names from the tunnel again, comparing them to the missing children's list. They matched, every single one. He knew he had to speak with the only person left alive who might understand the full extent of it. Abigail Finch. He returned to the sanatorium the next morning. The receptionist looked up, confused. She passed last night, the nurse said. In her sleep. Peaceful, they said. We found her journal clutched in her hands. Charles froze. Journal. She wanted you to have it. He opened the small leather-bound book in the lobby. The first page read, "To the one who finally listens, let the truth drown no more." He turned to the last entry, dated the day before her death. I never stopped hearing them. The sea still whispers. They never screamed, not once, just silence. As if they'd already accepted it, as if they knew. Please, Charles, let them be remembered. Bury what the sea refused to. refused to keep. He shut the book, and for the first time in his career, Charles felt something deeper than outrage, deeper than horror. He felt responsibility. A hollow knock at the door startled Silas. From his thoughts, he tucked the map into the folds of his coat and stepped out of the room, moving toward the sound. It was Thomas, one of the older boys, trembling in the hallway with a torn coat, his face scraped and bleeding. "They took Maggie," he whispered, voice hoarse. "They took her to the beach." Silas gripped Thomas's shoulders. Who took her?" Thomas glanced behind him. "The sisters. I heard them chanting. Maggie was crying. She begged them not to take her." Silas felt his chest tighten, the sea's roar suddenly louder in his ears. He nodded slowly. "Where?" "Cliffside, where the fog swallows everything." The shoreline was as bleak as it had ever been, even in the stillness of the evening. The wind slashed across Silas's face like razors. They reached the cliffsea, Thomas and Clara. The path was slick with moss, but their feet found instinctive purchase on the stones. As they neared the edge, the sound of voices echoed through the mist. They crouched behind a jagged boulder. Just beyond, Sister Mercy stood in her black veil, her face turned upward as if speaking to the heavens or something else entirely. Beside her, Sister Ruth clutched a small bundle wrapped in linen. Silas blinked. It was Maggie, unmoving. The sisters were praying not in English, but in an older tongue, ancient and percussive. It sounded like waves smashing against stone. Clara's hand tightened around his. Thomas swallowed back a cry. Then, without ceremony, Sister Ruth stepped forward, and in one chilling movement, she hurled Maggie into the sea. The body vanished. Below the surf, no scream, no splash, only silence. Silas's world spun. Clara began to sob, pressing her face against her arm to muffle the sound. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, voice brittle. "We go back," Silas said, trying to anchor himself to something. "We go back, and we write it down, all of it." That night, Silas did not sleep. By candlelight, he recorded everything, what they saw, what they heard, the names of the sisters involved, the location, the rituals, the voices. He documented it all. In the margins of the geography book, Father Barlow had once praised him for reading. The same book now riddled with damp smudges and fingerprints of sea salt. He was done running. This was no longer about survival. It was about truth. Clara sat across from him, clutching a threadbare doll. "Will anyone believe us?" "They don't have to," Silas said. "We'll leave proof." In the weeks that followed, more children disappeared. Silas tracked every one. The patterns became clearer. Always a girl, always alone, always quiet and small enough to carry, and always taken during a night with fog. They came from the sea, the sisters said. The children belonged to it, returned, not taken. The children were offerings. The word made Silas sick. The three of them, Silas, Clara, Thomas, began to gather the others, quietly, carefully, whispered warnings in the dormitories, slipped notes under pillows, watching the older orphans who might report them. Some didn't believe, some laughed, some vanished, and when Jonas tried to tell Sister Mercy, his body was found the next day, broken neck, fell from the third-floor window, they said. Silas knew better. One late afternoon, while scouring the library's locked cabinet, Silas found an old trunk, rusted latch, heavy leather binding. Inside were yellowed documents, ledgers from the orphanage's founding years. Among them, something stranger. A letter dated 1793, addressed to the custodians of the Salt Covenant. It read, "The ritual binds the land. The salt feeds the sea, and the sea returns the favor. The children are payment, yes, but more than that, they are inheritance. Each one purifies the contract anew. Without sacrifice, the waves consume everything. If one generation fails, the land will drown, as it once did in ages past." It was signed by a name Silas didn't recognize. Elias Breen, That name mattered. He searched again through the old orphan records, and finally found it. Elias Breen, founding patron, 1790. Annotation said he secured coastal rights and established maritime authority in the region. There was a drawing of him, stern, bearded, dressed like a minister. Clara leaned over the page. They think they're saving us. Saving themselves, Silas corrected. The next storm came a week later, and with it, the sisters moved fast. They locked down the west wing. No supper, no fire, only prayer. Silas made his decision. We escape tonight. By midnight, 20 children were crammed in the basement passageway Silas had mapped from the laundry room. He had bribed a handyman with a bottle of gin to leave the door unlatched. They moved in silence, but as they reached the outer cellar door, it opened on its own. Sister Mercy stood there, behind her 2 figures with lanterns, Sister Ruth and Sister Catherine. No one spoke. The children froze. Then Sister Mercy smiled, going somewhere. Silas stepped in front of the children, shielding them with his body. Clara clutched Thomas's arm, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Sister Mercy's smile did not falter. "You've always been a bright boy, Silas," she said, her voice as calm as rain. "But brightness attracts shadows." He said nothing. Behind him, the younger children whimpered. The cold from the cellar walls clung to their skin, but fear chilled them far more. "You don't have to do this," Silas said finally. "Sister." Ruth stepped forward, lantern casting ghoulish shapes on the stone walls. "Don't have to, child. We must. You don't understand the contract. You think we're cruel monsters, but we're keepers. Without us, the sea would take you all. Anyway." She motioned toward the exit. "The flood has happened before this place was built. Before Elias Breen sealed the tide with sacrifice." Silas's voice trembled. "Maggie wasn't a sacrifice. She was a child." Sister Mercy's eyes glittered, and children are the only ones pure enough to hold the weight of the covenant. That was when Thomas lunged. He didn't scream or shout. He simply moved, grabbing the lantern from Sister Ruth's hand and smashing it against the cellar wall. The oil splashed. Fire ignited. Flames roared to life between them. "Run!" Thomas screamed. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed Clara's hand, and they tore through the tunnel, the other children surging behind. Smoke poured down from above, the flickering light, casting shadows like demons across the stone corridor. Behind them, they could hear shouting, Sister Catherine crying out, something crashing, a scream Ruth's, maybe, then silence, and the fire. They emerged into the woods behind the orphanage, panting, scratched, and coughing. Moonlight bathed the trees in silver, and the wind carried the scent of brine from the cliffs. Silas looked back. From this angle, he could just see the roof of the orphanage, flickering orange. The west wing was burning. Thomas stumbled out behind them, soot on his face, coughing violently, but alive. "We don't stop," Silas said. "We get to the village. We find the constable. We show them the records, the names, the proof. Will they believe us?" Clara asked, her voice small. "They don't have to," Silas said again, repeating it like a spell. "We'll make them listen." But the village was not what they expected. When they reached Harrow's Bay just before dawn, the streets were quiet to quiet. Not a single light in the windows. No dogs barking. No fishermen hauling nets. Just rows of empty homes and fog, clinging to the wood. And then, Silas saw it, etched into the doorframes of nearly every house. The same symbol from the geography book, the salt spiral, marked with a child's handprint in ashdot. Clara noticed it too. They knew. "No, Silas," said Hart, sinking. "They still do." They found the constable's station. The door was unlocked. The desk sat empty, the fire in the hearth long cold. On the wall hung a map of the region, old, frayed. In the center, drawn in red ink, was the coastline. Beside it, tidefall year projections. And below that, a single line in elegant cursive. Keep the sea fed, or it feeds on us all. Thomas picked up a dusty ledger from the desk. The cover was cracked leather, the spine marked sacrifices confirmed. He flipped through it. Every child's name was there, including Maggie, including Jonas, including Silas, dated for next spring. We have to leave, Clara whispered. We have to leave this whole place. Silas's hands trembled. No one outside Harrow's Bay knows. Then we'll go further, Thomas said, clutching the ledger. We'll cross the state line. Boston, maybe. Find someone who'll listen. But we need to be careful, Silas said. If the villagers know what we've done, what we saw, they'll come for us. Clara finished. And she was right, because behind them, from down the street, a bell began to ring. Not a church bell, not a town alarm, a deep, ancient clang, the sound of summoning. They ran, through side alleys, across the stone bridge, into the fields beyond. By mid-morning, they reached a distant barn on the outskirts of a neighboring town called Dorsey Hollow. It smelled of hay and mildew, but it was dry and safe. There, they made camp. Silas unwrapped the records and tucked them into a satchel. The ledger, the drawings, the names, they'd carry them wherever they went. They agreed on a plan. Wait 3 nights, then head for the coast, where a passing cargo ship might be bribed for passage out of Massachusetts. Anywhere but here, anywhere but the sea. That night, as they took turns keeping watch, Clara asked a question that haunted them all. What if the sea follows us? Silas didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, he opened the geography book and flipped to the back cover. Scratched faintly into the paper was a line in his own handwriting. Something he didn't remember writing. The sea never takes what it's owed, it waits for what's promised. He stared at it until his eyes stung. Then quietly he said, then we don't promise it anything ever again. But outside the barn, the fog had already begun to gather, and somewhere in the distance, something was singing. Not human, not quite wind, but ancient, and it was getting closer. The fire had spread faster than anyone expected. Old wood, dry curtains, wind that howled down chimneys and through fractured window panes like breath from the sea. By the time Silas made it down the second staircase, half the west wing was glowing red. Children were already scattering, some screaming, some dragging others by the arm, and some in a kind of stunned silence. Sister Catherine's robes were aflame as she stumbled through the hallway, her hands clawing at her face. She let out no scream, only a rasping moan before collapsing in a heap. Thomas emerged from the smoke with Clara, coughing violently. Her dress was scorched at the hem, but she was alive. They tried to block the kitchen door, Thomas said, eyes red. Ruth and Mercy, they were pushing furniture against it. Silas grabbed a broken chair and swung it into the window beside the stairwell. The glass shattered outward into the cold air. This way, he shouted. All of you, out through the east. They needed to get to the shore. Away from the building. And more importantly, away from the sisters. 15 children made it out with them. Clara's hand didn't leave Silas's coat the entire way down the path, even as the smoke behind them turned the sky a dull orange. But something strange happened. When they reached the rocky beach below, the fog was already there, thick, wet, alive. It wasn't just sea. Mist. It was heavier than any natural vapor, moving not with the breeze, but against it, like breath exhaled from below the waves. And in it, standing ankle-deep in water, was Sister Mercy. She was soaked, but untouched by fire. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. You think this ends with flames? She whispered. Silas stepped in, front of the others. You murdered them. Every child who vanished, Maggie, Elsie, Tobias, they were saved, Mercy said. You speak of murder, but it is not murder to deliver a soul to its master. Behind her, the sea began to churn. It wasn't high tide, and there was no storm, but the water rippled in spirals, as if something massive was just below the surface. Clara pressed her face into Silas's back. What is that? He didn't know, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. Then came the sound, not a roar, not a splash, a hum, deep, throbbing, like the pulse of the earth itself. Sister Mercy raised both arms. You see, it is still pleased, even now. Pleased with what? Thomas yelled. Your fear, she whispered, and from the sea, something rose, first a shape, a lump, then a glistening surface wet and shining like black stone. No form, at first, just movement and height. Then, tentacles. At least 6, maybe more, each as thick as a tree trunk, gliding silently across the water. The children screamed. Silas turned. Run. The fog chased them up the rocks. Not with speed, but inevitability. It clung to ankles, made the air thick, made it hard to breathe. One boy tripped. Another had to be carried. Silas and Thomas took turns pulling those who stumbled. Clara didn't cry, but she looked close. The sky turned strange, no longer night, but some dull color between blue and rust. A shriek echoed behind them, Sister Mercy's voice, but warped, inhuman, like her vocal cords were being pulled from her throat. Silas didn't look back. They reached the chapel, still intact, silent. It hadn't burned inside. The children collapsed to the floor, heaving. Clara's lips were bleeding from where she'd bitten down in fear. Silas barred the doors with an iron rod, but then he saw it etched into the floorboards of the chapel beneath the pulpit, a symbol, circular, with arrows pointing inward. Inside, the circle, a sigil of 7 spines surrounding a dark spiral. It wasn't Christian. It wasn't human. Clara touched his sleeve. What is it? A seal, Silas murmured, or a lock? Then who built it? He looked up at the beams above. Them, carved into the ceiling in faint, precise lines, were more of the same symbols, like this room wasn't for worship, but for containment. They weren't protecting us from the sea, he said slowly. They were protecting the sea from something. We forgot. There was a sound on the roof, like nails dragging across slate. Heavy footsteps, one by one. The children backed away from the walls. Then a voice soft, behind them. Not Sister Mercy, not a child. It came from the shadows near the altar. You lit the fire, it said. Silas turned. Standing there was a girl no one recognized. Her face pale, hair soaked as if she'd just emerged from the ocean. She wore no shoes. Her eyes were wrong. They shimmered like mirrors. I was the first, she said. Before Mercy, before Barlow, before they gave it names. Thomas raised a chair leg like a weapon. Stay back. But the girl didn't move forward. She only looked at the seal beneath their feet. You broke the pact, she said. Silas stepped in front of the others. What pact? She tilted her head. Your ancestors gave us salt, blood, names. We gave you shore, fish, fire, tom tides. The chapel trembled. The air felt thick and hollow. We are balance, the girl said. You are theft. She looked down at the seal again. Now ... it opens. And the floor cracked. The floor split with a sound like cracking bone. Not just a break, but a rupture that felt ancient. The sigil beneath the pulpit split perfectly down its spiral center. Cold air rushed upward from the gap, smelling not of sea salt, but of rot and old stone, like a tomb long buried beneath the waves. The pale girl stood perfectly still. She didn't seem afraid. If anything, she looked relieved. You were never meant to remember, she whispered. You were meant to obey. Silas pulled Clara behind him. Thomas was already helping the children climb onto the pews. The floorboards peeled back in circular pieces, like a flower opening in reverse. And from beneath, a shape began to rise. Not a creature, not entirely. More like a collection of limbs, shells, and bone twisting, grinding, alive, but not truly living. Its skin was barnacled and pale gray. Its movement defied logic like it floated through stone as easily as water. Eyes far too many blinked open in its surface. Breath caught. It didn't look evil. It looked patient, as if it had always been waiting, as if the chapel had always been its lid. The children screamed. Back. Silas shouted. To the far wall now. The walls groaned. The ceiling cracked. The girl by the altar didn't move. She stepped forward, arms spread as if inviting the thing to her. I was born in the tide, she said, eyes glowing faintly. I've waited across centuries, but now it rises again. Then she began to hum low, monotonous, a single note, echoing through the chapel like it belonged here. The creature responded. Its mass slithered through the floor, reaching with fingers that weren't quite fingers. Clara tugged at Silas' coat. We can't fight that. He knew. This wasn't something you fought. It was something you unleashed or contained. That sigil, the seal on the floor, wasn't just protection. It was a prison. He looked at the burning orphanage up the hill, and then at the chapel windows. One was missing a pane. Thomas, Silas said suddenly, the salt, from the stores. You said they used to line the chapel walls with it. Thomas blinked, then nodded. Barrels, in the cellar below. Get it? While Thomas disappeared beneath the altar, the thing fully breached the floor. It didn't roar. It breathed one long inhale that made the air ripple. Every child shrank back, against the walls. Clara clung to Silas's waist, her breath shaking. The pale girl now knelt before the creature, humming louder. The stone at her feet cracked with every note. Then Thomas reappeared, dragging a small sack. Only a little left, he said. The rest was taken. Enough, Silas whispered. It has to be. He pulled the cloth open, fingers shaking. Thick, white salt, damp, heavy, clumped like old ash. He didn't need to redraw the sigil. He just needed to complete the circle again. He ran. Every step forward felt like moving through sludge. The creature turned toward him, not with a face. There was no face, but with awareness. As if it sensed intention. It reached a limb toward Silas, and time slowed. He remembered the others who vanished. Elsie's red ribbons, Tobias's voice, Maggie's drawings in the margins of hymnals. He remembered the cold nights when the sisters said, "Some things belong to the sea, and you are only visitors." But he wasn't a visitor anymore. He was a wall. Silas hurled the salt into the broken spiral, completing the circle rough, rushed, imperfect, but whole. The reaction was instant. The humming stopped. The pale girl's eyes widened. No, the creature shrieked not loudly, but in vibration. The pews shook. The windows shattered inward. Clara dropped to her knees, covering her ears. Thomas pulled two younger boys beneath the altar, shielding their heads, and the creature began to sink. Not fall, not retreat. It was being pulled, as if something ancient below the chapel had reawakened, as if the prison had remembered its duty. The limbs curled. The spiral glowed faintly, and with one final groan, the thing slipped beneath the earth. The pale girl with it? She didn't scream. She only said, "We'll wait again." Then she was gone. Silence fell. Not a natural silence, but a silencing. Like sound had been swallowed. The crack in the floor sealed over slowly, plank by plank, until only the faint burn mark of the old spiral remained, and the air lightened. The chapel stood still. Only the fire at the orphanage still roared in the distance. Later that morning, as the sun broke through the smoke-filled sky, a small group of townspeople came up the hill. They'd seen the fire. They hadn't known what they were walking into. They found 20 children curled together in the old chapel, covered in dust and salt and soot that Clara didn't let go of Silas's hand until she saw a familiar face. No one ever found Sister Mercy's body, or Sister Catherine's, or Barlow's. The fire consumed the orphanage entirely, all records with it. That winter, the town rebuilt a school, but not on the same land. The chapel was boarded shut. Salt was scattered around it in wide rings. The townspeople never asked why. Silas never told them. He grew up and became a carpenter. Clara lived with him until she married. Thomas left the state entirely, but none of them ever returned to the cliff road, and when the fog came in thick during spring, no one let their children near the shore, not after what happened, not after what they'd fed back to the sea.